few weeks ago, I spoke here, and I spoke on the subject of giving, and I talked about grace, and I talked about freedom, and I talked about love. And today, I'm going to speak about a passage in the Old Testament, and it's about murder and adultery and civil war, but also forgiveness and restoration and lots of encouraging things as well. But just as a warning, as we read this passage and talk about it, it is a story about some of the most painful things we go through in life, of betrayal and the death of a child and families falling out. And these are serious and difficult things. And the reassuring thing is that the Bible does not leave us alone in these things. The Bible talks about these things and helps us to process these things. And really, this talk is about messing up. What happens when we mess up? What happens when the people around us mess up? How do we process that? What do we do about it? What does God do in those situations? So let's look at this passage in 2 Samuel and chapter 11 and 12. And actually what we're going to do, I think we might do is, I would suggest don't try and follow this in the Bible. You can open the passage if you want to, 2 Samuel 11 and 12. But then what I would do is I'm going to read it over us, and I'm going to skip a few bits because it's quite long. But it's probably easiest if we just listen to this passage as I read it, and we take in what's going on in this passage. So here it is. In the spring, this is 2 Samuel chapter 11. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab, his great general, out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman washing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." And then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanliness. Then she went home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to the house. And then what follows after that is David finds other ways of trying to get Uriah to go home to his wife, Bathsheba, to sleep with her in order to cover up the crime. But Uriah refuses to enjoy the things that the other soldiers in the army are not able to enjoy. And so in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. And so a message comes back to David about what's happened. And it says this: when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. The Lord sent Nathan to David. Nathan was a prophet. And when he came to him, he said, "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, But the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. He shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity." Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hands of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own." Then David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan replied, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die." After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the night lying in sackcloth on the ground. But very sadly, the child of David and Bathsheba does die. And then it says later, "Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba. He went to her and made love to her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah." Today, as I said, we're going to talk about messing up. One moment. That was surprisingly difficult. We're going to talk about messing up, and really the 4 stages of what happens. So the first stage is this. There is the sin. And here the crime is multiple. I mean, it's the crime of adultery, because Bathsheba is married to another man. It's the crime of murder, because David has Uriah killed in order to cover up the crime. It's the crime of stealing, because David finds a way of taking what belongs to another and taking it for himself. It's the crime of lying, because David is trying to cover up what he's done. It's the crime of coveting, because David wants for himself what belongs to another. And so in just 2 chapters of the Bible, David manages to break at least 5 of the 10 commandments. But more than that, there are other crimes here as well. In the Middle Ages, theologians came up with a list of the 7 deadly sins, and David breaks at least 6 of them here. I mean, there's pride. David thinks he can do this because maybe the same rules don't apply to him as apply to other people. There's the crime of lust. He looks at this woman when she's bathing and he wants her for himself. It's the crime of envy, because he envies what belongs to Uriah. It's the crime of anger, because he burns with rage when he hears this story about someone else in his kingdom doing something wrong. It's the crime of sloth, laziness, because David, I don't know whether you noticed in the beginning, is sleeping during the day when he has plenty of work to do. He's supposed to be running a kingdom. And there's other crimes too. We see also the crime of prejudice. Uriah is a Hittite, and so he's a foreigner. And so maybe David feels like Maybe it doesn't matter what I do to him because he's not really one of us. It's the crime of control, the misuse of power. Do you notice that David is the one in control here? He is the one who does everything. He sends, he takes, he controls the people and manipulates the people around him. It's the crime of the misuse of public office, because he uses the tools of the state, his servants, his attendants, the general of his army, in order to get for himself what he wants for himself personally. And it's a crime against so many people. It's a crime against Uriah, who was one of David's mighty men, one of the people that fought alongside David, one of his most loyal and trusted friends and companions. It's a crime against Bathsheba. It's one of the interesting things about this passage, about how Bathsheba's role in this is portrayed. When I was young, when I was a boy, I had an older brother called Henry, and Henry would more often get into trouble and didn't really mind getting told off, whereas I never really got into trouble and really hated being told off. But every now and again, I would get caught up in something that my older brother Henry was doing. And so my parents would tell us off together, and they would say, "Henry, you shouldn't have done that. That was really naughty." And my brother wouldn't really care. And then they would just turn to me and go, "And Jonny, what you did was also not very good," as gently as they could, and then I would burst into tears. Now, here, there is no sense of that with Bathsheba. When David is later confronted with his sin, there's at no point is there any mention in the scriptures of, "And Bathsheba, what about your role in this?" Because David was king and she was a subject. David was rich and she was poor. David had all the power and she had none of the power. And so there is no blame actually attached to Bathsheba in this. The only things we know about Bathsheba is that she was washing herself in accordance with the law. She says, "I am pregnant," she speaks the truth, and then she mourns her husband. And so it's a crime against Bathsheba. David takes the opportunity when he's got all these attendants at his disposal, and she has no one to protect her because her husband is away. It's also a crime against David's own wives and over his children. Because David, I forgot to say, I missed in the 7 deadly sins, the crime of greed. Do you know how many wives David already had? He had 7 wives already. But he wants just one more. But this is a crime against his existing wives, and it's a crime against his children, because his children will see the example of David, and they will begin to follow the same patterns later. It's a crime against Joab, his general, because he gives Joab these commands which put Joab in an impossible situation of either obeying the command of the king or putting his own troops in danger. It's a crime against his people, because actually not only Uriah, but many other people die too. And so this is the great crime. And you think, how did this happen? David, who was so godly, a man after God's own heart, someone who had served God faithfully, how did he wrote all these psalms? How did this happen? Well, I suppose he's isolated because his companions have gone off to war. I suppose he's bored because he's not doing what he should be in terms of being with his men and leading them and encouraging them and helping them. But also there's been a change in his life. Before, he was in a position of weakness. He was on the run. He was living in caves, sleeping in caves, totally dependent on God. But now suddenly he's living in a palace. His army is powerful, and he doesn't need God in the same way. And maybe he's got used to the power. He's got used to being able to say to someone, "Fetch me this, do this." And after maybe a few years of people doing exactly what he wanted, he found it hard to then respect any boundaries of anything that he wasn't allowed to do. And so this is the sin. Which then brings to the next stage, which is conviction, which is where we come to the realization that we have sinned. And there were numerous opportunities for David to come to this realization, and it should have happened earlier. I mean, what we should really have read was that David saw this woman bathing on the roof, and he looked away and thought, I'm not going to go walking along the roof at this time of night again. I'll walk around in the gardens at ground level and make sure there are companions with me to make sure I'm not put into temptation. Or maybe later, he's looking at her and he sends an attendant to find out who she is. And someone comes back and says, she's married to Uriah, the Hittite. And he says, I'm sorry. I don't know why I let my mind go that way. I'm going to thank God that Uriah, my great friend, has been blessed with such a beautiful wife. And I'll get back to work. Or even later, after he slept with Bathsheba, when Uriah is sent to him and Uriah comes into his presence. Maybe David could have fallen to his knees, started weeping and said, Uriah, I've messed up. I've slept with your wife. I'm so sorry. It was not her fault at all. I'm the one who must take the blame. But he doesn't. And then even after he has Uriah killed, it could have been that the first thing he does is send word to Nathan and say, I've messed up worse than I could ever have imagined. Please come and see me. I don't know what to do. But he doesn't. In fact, he thinks he's got away with all of it. But God sends Nathan. And Nathan confronts him of his sin and tells him this parable. And you can tell that something's not quite right with David, because it says that David burns with anger when he hears about the sin that someone else has committed. And anger, people talk about it being a secondary emotion, which hides other things going on. So maybe fear, maybe shame. And so this anger spills out from David because he knows deep down. But actually, he deep down he knows it, but in his mind he can't see it. Because actually we're all blind to the things that we've done wrong. It's part of human nature. We can't really see it. And so we need other people to help us see the things that we've done wrong. We need friends to show us when we've messed up. And actually it's one of the most loving things that we can do. When I left university, I worked for a bit as a nanny, so someone who looks after children, like a male nanny. And so I looked after this boy who was 12 years old, and he was looked after by a very rich uncle who basically neglected him. His uncle was an art dealer, and he neglected this boy. And this boy wanted to be evil. That's what he said to me. He was 12 years old and wanted to be evil. And he used to watch really violent films and play very violent video games. And so I started looking after him, and I took away all the really violent films he had and all the violent video games he had. And he was really cross about that and really resented me. But he was also looking for love. And this 12-year-old boy used to take me by the hand and look up at me and say, "Do you love me, Jonny? Do you love me?" He was just desperate to be loved. So I looked after him for about 18 months, and then I stopped. I moved on to other things. But then I went to see him a little while later, just to check in on him. And he said, "Oh, come up to my bedroom." So I went up to his bedroom. And on his bed, there were all these very violent video games and violent and inappropriate films. And he came up and he saw that I saw them. And then he sort of made a show of covering them up with his duvet and said, "Oh, no, please don't take those away. Don't take those away." And I said, actually, I don't work for your uncle anymore, so actually I can't take them away. And he looked up at me and said, "Oh, no, you can if you want to. Please, will you take them away?" And actually what this boy wanted more than anything was someone to care about what he did, even if it meant confronting him about the worst things that he'd done. And Nathan is the great friend of David who confronts David. And David actually will be eternally grateful to Nathan. And later, David and Bathsheba will have more sons after Solomon. And one of the sons that they will call Nathan, to remember the friend who was willing to confront them and to confront David about what he'd done. And so he's confronted. And David, when he's confronted, and Nathan says, "You are the man." This passage is so clever, because what happens when we read this story is we think, this is terrible what David's done. How could he? He deserves to die. He is just a terrible person. But then the words of Nathan to David actually become the words spoken over us. You are the man. You are the woman. Because Jesus will later say, whoever looks lustfully on anyone, you've committed adultery in your heart. Jesus says, if you ever lost your temper and called someone a fool, you're guilty of murder in your heart. Actually, we are all guilty. We are all the man, the woman. And David, to his credit, when he's confronted, he says some of the words which are the easiest words to say and the hardest words to say. I have sinned against the Lord. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't try to justify himself or excuse himself. He could have said, but I love her. I love her. I've married her. We want to have children together. I want her child to be king after me. I really love her. He doesn't say, well, no, this is the culture. This is what kings do. Look around us. This is how kings behave. I'm just behaving like everyone else. Or he could have said, well, I'm not as bad as some kings. Have you seen the kings of Assyria, the kings of Egypt? This is nothing compared with them. Go and confront them. And then once you've confronted them, I'll be willing to look at my own actions. But other people are far worse than me. Or he could have said, oh no, it's Bathsheba's fault. She shouldn't have been bathing naked. It was her fault. She led me astray. But he doesn't do any of those things. He doesn't even say, oh, but I've been such a good king in so many other ways. Look at all the good I've done. He says, I have sinned. He admits he's got it wrong. Which takes us to step 3, which is forgiveness and consequences. Because what Nathan says to David is the Lord has taken away your sins, but there also need to be consequences. The Lord has taken away your sins. The phrasing of that's really important. It's not, luckily, David, your sin wasn't too bad, and so it can be forgiven. It doesn't matter how great or terrible the sin was. It's because the Lord has taken away your sin. And if God forgives you, then you are forgiven. Because it depends not on the size of your sin, but on the size of God's power and grace and mercy and love. And so he says, your sins are taken away. It's completely removed. But he also says, but there are consequences as well. And terrible consequences. And so there are people who will die. The kingdom will go into civil war. Because our actions always have consequences. And actually one of the terrifying things about this story is David, when he hears this parable spoken by Nathan, he says about the man stealing a sheep, he says, that man must pay back 4 times the amount what he took. And tragically in David's life, 4 of David's children will die. It's what he spoke over this situation, and it comes back to him. And so there are consequences, and the consequences are delayed, they spill out, and they're not really fair. But when we do things that are wrong, it always has consequences. But then crucially, we get to stage 4, which is restoration. Because the story ends with another child being born. And this child is called Solomon, which means, it's from Shalom, it means peace. And Jedediah, which means beloved of Yahweh. And so the story ends not with death and division, but with peace and love and life. And so David's great act of folly will lead to the birth of Solomon, the wisest king that's ever lived. Because God has the power to turn the worst things that have ever happened in our lives into the best things. There is no situation that he cannot redeem. At our church back in England, before we came here, there was a couple there called Simon and Cheryl. And they shared their story, so I feel I have permission. They've shared it on a podcast and very publicly. When they married very young, and they had two girls called Jem and Charlie. And when the girls were about 5 or 3, they weren't Christians, and there was unfaithfulness in the marriage. And they split up, and they got divorced. And suddenly the girls, from having a very happy childhood, were suddenly devastated. They were spending the weeks with their mother and the weekends with their father. And life was really painful and difficult. And then Cheryl, the mother, found out about a friend of hers who had always struggled with drugs and actually got so bad she'd ended up in prison. But this friend of hers had picked up a Bible in prison and had started reading it and had become a Christian. And she'd come out of prison telling everyone about Jesus, standing on park benches, proclaiming that Jesus is Lord. And Cheryl went to see her friend and could not believe the change in her. And this friend invited Cheryl to church. And so Cheryl went to church, and she became a Christian. And so then Cheryl went to find her ex-husband, Simon, and said to him, "Please, will you come to church?" And he didn't want to, but eventually he agreed. And he came and he sat in church, and he thought, "I do not want to be here. I don't believe any of this. I don't want to be here. But God, if you're real, show yourself to me." And after he prayed that prayer, a woman came up to him and said, "I've got a prophetic word for you." And it was a prophetic word that matched exactly what he was feeling and exactly what he was thinking. And so then and there in that service, Simon became a Christian. And so they decided they would need to get back together. But Cheryl, in those early days, when the marriage was falling apart, she had gone to her parents' house and she'd taken off her wedding ring. And she went into her parents' garden, this huge, long, kind of old English garden, and threw her wedding ring away. And it went beyond the garden into these kind of bushes and some trees behind. And then when she told her parents that she and her husband were going to get back together, her mother said, "Actually, on that day you threw your wedding ring, your father and I went and we started searching for your ring. And it took hours and hours and hours, and we were digging in the mud and digging in the mud. But eventually we found your wedding ring. And we've held on to it now for all this time, and we've been praying and praying in faith that God would do a miracle." And so Simon and Cheryl got remarried. They had to get remarried. They had to do everything all over again. The same wedding ring. They had another daughter, Izzy, who did our church internship whilst Tara and I were there pastoring the church. And after all that time, Simon and Cheryl started fostering loads and loads of different people. Children and teenagers, and often mothers who were single mothers who found themselves pregnant. They would take them into their home and look after them throughout the first year of them having a child. And now their children, their oldest child, Jem, is now fostering as well. And they take people who've been trafficked, children, minors, people under the age of 18 who've been trafficked into the UK. They foster them and look after them and take care of them. Because the last word is not our sin or death or division or all the consequences that often come, but the last word belongs to God. And it is life, and it is love, and it is peace. And of course, all this points ahead to the cross. Because on the cross, Jesus takes the place of the victim. Jesus is like Uriah, because he too was betrayed by a friend and killed when he was innocent. He's like Bathsheba because David, he's stripped naked. He's naked on a cross, and all these people who had no right to look at him are staring at him. He's like the victim of every crime and every sin. And on the cross, Jesus is also like David. And because on the cross, Jesus takes on all our sins, everything we've ever done wrong. And actually, Nathan spoke over David and said, "You are the man." And later, 1,000 years later, Pilate will make Jesus stand in front of everyone and will say, "Behold the man." And Jesus takes on our sin. But then he also removes it. One of the most uncomfortable parts of this story is the fact that it says that this innocent baby of David and Bathsheba has to die. An innocent son of David has to die for things to be put right. And 1,000 years later, Jesus would be that innocent son of David, who he himself would die in order to take away the sins of the whole world and all the consequences of everything we've ever done. And so instead, we get the titles of Solomon, peace and beloved of God. Those are the words spoken over us. And those are the things that will define our future. Amen.